The biggest sleeper for the 2024 fantasy football season based on ADP is actually two wide receivers on the same team, and it matches with my quarterback sleeper as well too, and that's Christian Kirk and Brian Thomas Jr. as the wide receiver 1A and 1B on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Kirk can be found as a wide receiver 3 in ADP in the mid rounds, and BTJ is going outside the top 45 in the 9 to 11th rounds depending on your platform. So let's start with Christian Kirk, who I fully believe is returning to the wide receiver 1 spot on this team, at least in terms of total targets. He was the wide receiver 1 in 2022, leading the team in all receiving stats across the board, and actually, up until his injury last year, was the wide receiver 1 in 2023. He was out targeting Calvin Ridley and was the more productive fantasy player too. The same goes for Evan Ingram, who Kirk was also out targeting prior to getting hurt, and Ingram's production didn't really explode until after Christian Kirk's injury. So if we move into 2024, assuming that Kirk maintains that role in what is essentially the same offense it's been for the last 2 years, Kirk is more than likely going to lead this team in targets and could return to his 2022 production of over 14 fantasy points per game as a top 20 fantasy wide receiver. Or worst case scenario, he basically just replicates what he did last year before he got hurt, which was still a top 25 wide receiver, which is still outperforming his current ADP. Really what drafting Kirk allows you to do is to take some risk earlier in your drafts with high upside players, because Kirk is going to be that consistent wide receiver 3 or flex play to where if you hit on an earlier bets, you could be looking at an elite roster with tons of upside every single week because you have that stable wide receiver 3 or flex play in Christian Kirk. Now on the flip side, let's say you go a little bit safer early on and you're looking for that high upside bet later in your drafts. Then that would be Brian Thomas Jr. going a few rounds after Christian Kirk. And this gives me a chance to hit you with one of my hot takes for the 2024 fantasy season. I believe that Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be the second best rookie wide receiver this year behind Marvin Harrison Jr., better than Rome Odunze, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, Keon Coleman, anyone else that you think that should be up there. BTJ is going to outproduce all of them except for Marvin Harrison Jr. There is a clear-cut path to BTJ just replacing Calvin Ridley essentially in this offense, which if you don't remember is a 1,000-yard receiver with 8 touchdowns on 136 targets. That is what 29-year-old and very rusty Calvin Ridley did last year as the X receiver in this offense. Now you plug in a 21-year-old with 4.33 speed coming off a massive breakout season at LSU last year, and 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns almost feels like a median outcome. Like BTJ wouldn't even really need to try all that hard, and he can just replicate what Calvin Ridley did last year. But if you watched my quarterback sleeper breakout bust video, you saw a compilation of near miss touchdowns from Jaguars receivers last year, and a large majority of them came from Calvin Ridley. Enter Brian Thomas, who was excellent at LSU in the red zone and along the boundary to the tune of 17 receiving touchdowns last year. If he's able to haul in just some of these drops and field awareness lapses, his numbers could be even more insane than just a 1,000-yard receiving season as a rookie. And not to mention that last year, Trevor Lawrence excelled on intermediate to deep throws, especially over the middle and left side of the field. Compare that to BTJ's chart, which shows his massive success on intermediate to deep routes, especially on routes that shade to the middle or left side of the field. And this is literally a perfect match, and BTJ's skill set is just going to break open this offense's dynamic abilities as a whole, and rising tides raise all ships. Now, before we move on, I wanted to let y'all know to head over to 4for4.com and sign up for a subscription today to gain access to the industry's best fantasy rankings from award-winning ranker for accuracy, John Paulson. Plus, you get access to our live draft assistant, cheat sheets, trade calculator, articles, and there are additional packages for DFS and betting content as well. Make sure to use the code YouTube at checkout to receive 25% off of your annual subscription today. Now, moving on to my breakout candidate, I'm kind of shocked to see George Pickens all the way down around wide receiver 30 in the 5th or 6th rounds of drafts, despite being in the absolute best situation of his entire career so far. I mean, it's everything we've ever wanted for Pickens, yet he's still only valued as a wide receiver 3. The only real reason that I can even possibly think of is just Arthur Smith. That's the only real negative that happened this offseason for Pickens' 2024 outlook. If you can even call it a negative, honestly, because for all the crap that Smith put us through in Atlanta, he still gave us an absolute alpha wide receiver in Drake London, who averaged a 29 and 23% target share in both seasons of his career. And let's not forget that Smith's last role as an offensive coordinator, not head coach, an actual offensive coordinator, was in Tennessee back in 2019 and 2020 that had A.J. Brown finish as the wide receiver 21 and wide receiver 14. Again, on massive 20% and 26% target shares in that Titans offense. So now bringing it back to George Pickens, who just posted an 1,100-yard season on a 22% target share, he now has to compete with who? Roman Wilson, Van Jefferson, Calvin Austin, Pat Freiermuth? I mean, how does Pickens not see at minimum a 25% target share in this offense? Even if Pittsburgh throws the ball 500 times again like they did last year, a 25% target share puts Pickens at 125 targets, 20 more than he had last season. If Pittsburgh throws 530 times like Atlanta did last year under Arthur Smith, with way worse quarterback play, that is over 130 targets for George Pickens on the season. With that target total for the type of player that Pickens is, he could realistically have a Nico Collins type season at wide receiver 11, a Mike Evans type season at wide receiver 7, or a DJ Moore type season at wide receiver 6. Those are all in Pickens' range of outcomes this year. And I don't care who the quarterback is either. We just watched Russell Wilson resurrect Courtland Sutton's career with double-digit touchdowns last year, and Pickens is way better than Courtland Sutton is at this point in their careers. And if it's Justin Fields, then that's fine too, because guess who was the quarterback for DJ Moore's wide receiver 6 finish last year? Yeah, so George Pickens is a must draft for me at his ADP, which you could realistically start off with 2 high-end receivers, 2 stud running backs, and grab a high upside home run swinging Pickens as your wide receiver 3. It is just absolutely perfect, and everybody should be trying to grab him in the mid rounds of your drafts. And then finally, we have to talk about my bust candidate for 2024. And this hurts me a lot to say because I really like Chris Olave, but I just don't see him living up to his wide receiver 10 to 12 ADP as a second round pick in drafts this year on both ESPN and Yahoo platforms. That just doesn't make sense to me. I could honestly end this argument right here and say that Chris Olave has never finished above wide receiver 20 in PPR formats on a points per game basis. That's just the truth. And this team is almost a carbon copy of itself from last year. Nothing's changed. It's still Derek Carr at quarterback. No other real target competition for massive targets, so Olave is still easily going to be the team's wide receiver 1 for a first-time play caller in Clint Kubiak. And if you look at Olave's numbers from last year, there was a lot to really like. He was 12th in total targets at 8.5 per game. He was 4th in deep targets, 6th in total air yards, and he averaged over 25% target share and target rate. Both good for top 20 in the league. All absolutely amazing numbers that you would love for any wide receiver, especially for a young and up-and-coming talent like Chris Olave. The issue, though, is touchdowns. He only scored 5 last year, 4 in 2022 as a rookie, and that comes mainly from a lack of red zone targets, which he was 33rd in the league in last year. So if he's not able to convert these big plays into touchdowns and he's not getting many red zone targets, touchdowns just aren't going to really fall for him. And that's a huge difference between a wide receiver finishing as a top 20 guy versus a top 10 guy. Even his expected fantasy points per game last year, which were 3 points per game higher than his actual points per game, still only puts him at wide receiver 17 in 2023. So with an ADP around wide receiver 10, you are expecting him to have his breakout season when nothing has realistically changed from last year to this year. He's being drafted ahead of guys like Nico Collins, Brandon Ayuk, Jalen Waddle, DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, Michael Pittman, Cooper Kupp even. All guys who have done it before, and most have done it for multiple years, and you can get all of them in the 3rd or even 4th rounds of your drafts, not the 2nd round. Even Drake London is going around later in ESPN drafts, and I'd argue that London has a higher probability of having his breakout this year, considering the massive quarterback upgrade that he got. It just doesn't make sense to draft a guy like Olave as a cornerstone player on your team, but with so little upside to actually make a difference over guys that you can get later. They say that you can't win your league during the draft, but you can absolutely lose it.